Rebellion Show, and today I'm here with candidate Emilie Tindle, who is running for the Oklahoma State House of Representatives in District 11. Uh, how are you doing today?
I'm okay. How are you?
I'm doing all right. So, first question is, where are you and where are you from? Like, where did you grow up at?
Yeah. So the district, northeast Oklahoma. So the southern tip is Collinsville, which is where I live. And then it stretches all the way up Highway 75 to Bartlesville. And it includes pretty much all of Bartlesville except the most western portion and the most northern portion above like the downtown strip. Vera is a small town of about 250 people. Vera is about in the middle of the district. And then it just skirts around Ramona. So Ramona is not part of it. So about 36,000 people, most of them in Bartlesville. And then I actually grew up in Tulsa. So let's see, 41st and Mingo, roughly. So I'm a Tulsa girl, but I have family ties to Collinsville and Bartlesville. So it's a familiar area.
All right, that's cool. Tell me more about your childhood and your upbringing.
Yeah, so I was homeschooled growing up. So that's a little bit, it's not necessarily different for Oklahoma, but it's different, I think, for people entering this sphere. I knew of a lot of Republican homeschooled politicians or people that were very conservative growing up. So as a Democrat now, and as I would call myself a progressive, it's very different to have changed this much in 24 years, but I'm much happier now. So growing up, I read a lot of books, played a lot outside. Like it was just very active and imaginative. So trying to build new systems or have ideas. I mean, that's what we played forever. We would overthrow evil powers and bring good systems into play. So it's not like I'm play acting now. It's just that I'd already had that mentality back then.
All right. So, what do you currently do in life right now?
Yeah, so I went to Tulsa Tech with my last year of high school to put my husband through graduate school. And I worked in eye care for about 5 years before we came back to Oklahoma when I started taking classes at Oklahoma State University. And while I was doing that, I was working full time doing social media for a small business. So I kind of redid their whole social media structure, how they do it, kind of created a whole new thing for them. So I was able to quit that back in the fall. I've continued to take classes, and now I'm just sorry. Now I'm just taking classes and running for office.
All right, that's cool. So what made you want to run for state house?
Yeah, so I paged 3 times in high school, 2010, 2011, 2012, three of Oklahoma's probably worst years in recent history when it comes to funding education, the kinds of conversations we were having as a state. And of course, as a conservative at that time, I thought it was all okay. And so now looking back, it's kind of weird to see myself almost like watching from the outside, just this revolution since then. But so I paged, I saw how the House works, the House structure, is familiar with it. And we went up to Kansas, saw what happened in Kansas with Brownback's conservative experiment policies, felt some of the negative effects of that. So when we came back here, I didn't think I would run until I was in my 60s or 70s, but it was kind of always on my mind. And I was working full time, working 2 jobs actually, traveling for one of them across the Midwest. And one day I kind of popped my head up from work. I was in St. Louis for most of the entire month of April, which was filing month, back in 2018. And I realized that we were only going to have a Republican primary, not a general election. And at that point, filing was closed. There was nothing I could do, even though I thought, if filing's open, I'll just throw my name in there because it's better to have a general election than to not have one. Of course, it was closed. And so I just kind of kept that idea, but I wasn't going to do anything about it. And then at one point, a friend back in November of 2018, we somehow got talking about it. And he said, you could actually run. And I hadn't thought about it seriously just because, I'm 24. I don't feel like I have enough evidence to put forth that I would be a good candidate. And I was, it's a very unsecure, vulnerable spot to be in to do any of this, especially with what we've got going on right now. But he was right. The timing is right. Nobody else stepped up in the almost year and a half since that conversation. So it's me.
All right. I like that. That's an interesting story of how that happened. So the first thing listed on your website under priorities is healthcare.
Yes.
Some policies you'd like to implement in order to deal with our lack of health coverage in our state and to deal with some of the hospital closures.
Yeah. So there've been 10 hospital closures in Oklahoma, at least since Medicaid expansion would have been an option back in 2010, which I was there the day that they did that vote to not accept Medicaid expansion. I'm pretty sure that was May of 2010 or 2011. So I remember that. That's when I was paging. And so there's been 10 hospital closures. None of them have been in my area. They've all, for the most part, been like the perimeter of the state or some of the, I feel like an area around Muskogee lost one as well. But Bartlesville really doesn't have like a giant hospital structure. They've got some clinics, I think some urgent cares. So most of the time they're going to come to Tulsa anyways. So with all of that, I am a proponent of State Question 802. I signed it. I proudly collected signatures for it with the Tulsa County Democratic Party. I believe that full Medicaid expansion without any other sort of barriers is the way to go. So no work requirements, because there's the whole argument that those can end up preventing people from getting the care that they need. And then I also support full Medicaid expansion with no block grants. I think it's important that we fall under the existing structures. I think it's safer. Working in healthcare, I saw a lot of patients that would not have had the glasses that they needed, the eye care that they needed were not for Medicaid. And a lot of those were kids with very high prescriptions who would have been blind and not been able to pay attention in school or get through life if they didn't have that service. So I think it's critical, and that for me that includes healthcare includes dental and eye care coverage as well. I don't think those should be luxuries. I think those are critical as well. So for me, looking at Medicaid expansion, looking at any kind of healthcare access increase in Oklahoma, looking at the whole person is important. So the other thing is, especially being from Tulsa, living up in the Northeast, maternal health care rates are really critical, especially Black maternal health care rates, which I know that there's a big conversation about that happening in Tulsa right now. Somebody actually floated an idea a while back, I heard, to get doulas covered by Medicaid. So a doula's job in childbirth is to basically advocate for the mother. So what we see are maternal outcome rates for Black mothers are much worse than they are for white mothers. So a doula advocating for the mother while the nurses are there to care for the baby could potentially increase those outcomes for those moms, especially for ones that are dealing with things in more vulnerable situations. It would be really important, especially if you don't have somebody there with you. That's pretty critical, whether you're in a rural area or whether you're in a town. When it comes to hospital closures, when it comes to having to drive, all of that just makes the whole childbirth process a lot more tense, potentially negative. So it's important to have people there. So if Medicaid did cover doulas, that could be incredibly helpful for patient advocacy. The other ideas for healthcare, sorry if I'm running long. Drug cost caps are a huge conversation. I think Virginia and maybe it was Colorado just passed them on insulin. And I know that Senator Carrie Hicks had brought a piece of legislation to do that. I don't know that it got through committee. I feel like we would have heard if it did. So obviously capping the cost of insulin in the state is really critical, especially while the federal government is not doing their job when it comes to advocating for patients and lowering prescription drug prices. I know that the federal Congress has passed some, but they've been blocked by Mitch McConnell in the Senate. So until that whole thing shifts over, we're probably not going to see those come through. So as a state, I'd like to see us protect the interests of our vulnerable people, our patients. We're pretty unique. We've got 2 free health clinics, one in Bartlesville and one in Collinsville, and they serve a great portion of Northeast Oklahoma. People will drive an hour or so to come and try and get care, try and get some medications, prescriptions. That's just a symptom of what we have going on now. Because even if you have access to insurance, oftentimes it's too expensive to use it, or you have subpar insurance and it's like damage insurance basically. Unless you're dying, you're not going to be able to get care. For instance, the job that I last worked for, that small business, I would have been eligible for Medicaid expansion, and I was working as like a full-time professional, also college student. So not usually who people think of with Medicaid, because everybody has that image in their head of who's on Medicaid, whether that's correct or not. It's a stereotype, and I think it's important to note that with lower Oklahoma wages and with the state of the way things are right now, a lot of us would actually be on Medicaid. So having that conversation and being frank about it, I think, is important. So drug cost caps, full Medicaid expansion, ways to help maternal healthcare outcomes and infant healthcare outcomes. The last thing is mental health. Oklahoma doesn't have enough inpatient beds. That's pretty critical if we're going to be dealing with people that need critical services for long periods of time. And sometimes that's just what needs to happen. And we've been using our prison system to care for mental health patients, and that's pretty damaging both for the patient and for the whole system. And it increases that incarceration rate. So readjusting those resources and making sure that we can fully take care of the people in our state that have mental health crises is critical. There was a figure I think Oklahoma Policy Institute put out a couple weeks ago that up to like out of 4 million Oklahomans, 600,000 of them have self-reported a mental health issue. And I've had my own struggles with that and still, getting treatment for that as well. So I think it's important to also destigmatize that conversation. And again, pull that stereotype out of our heads and realize that, our neighbors, our friends, we all struggle with mental health from time to time. And destigmatizing that conversation is critical.
All right. So in the education part of your platform, you talk about putting more funding into education. What ways do you want to raise revenue for the state in order to do that?
Yeah. So the best way I see these issues is they all kind of interlock. And so when something kind of forms that connection, you have to find the best intervention in. Otherwise, you could potentially create some unintended ripple effects. So I think the conversation of new revenue really leads us to conversations about economic diversification. Because while oil and gas has certainly not been paying their fair share, they're also right that we can't purely rely on oil and gas when it comes to a revenue base. I would not use the argument that it's not fair to ONG because it is perfectly fair. They're extracting resources using our people. Often the boom and bust cycle really affects the state. And that's not the state's fault. That's not the workers' fault. But they're right in that we can't just use them. So that's where it's complicated too. Oklahoma relies a lot on income tax, which is fine, perfectly fine with that. Unfortunately, our lower income earners actually effectively pay more of their income than top earners do. And that's also because of the sales tax, which is actually a regressive tax. So one thing to do would be don't mess with the sales tax. You don't want to mess up municipal funding because cities are only funded off sales tax. But we should potentially raise the income tax slightly for our higher tax brackets. I don't know exactly what that number would look like right now. We'd have to run different numbers on that and see what would be acceptable. But that's one way to raise revenue. The other way is to make sure that we're taxing oil and gas at a competitive regional rate and then also a competitive rate nationally. Regional is fine usually to base things off of, but not all of our surrounding states are also oil producing states. Mm-hmm. So potentially looking at oil producing states like North Dakota, Texas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, and then making sure that we're at least competitive with that is important. If we want to be a top 10 state, we might even need to be a top 10 tax state for oil and gas. That might be a big part of it. They are extracting resources. Horizontal wells do sometimes ruin vertical wells. They can ruin farmland. So that extraction of resources comes at a cost to those around them, and they need to be paying for that collateral damage as well. Other than that, I've heard lots of different conversations floating around trying to tax different kinds of outside to in-state technologies. There's also the idea that Oklahoma can try and attract, because we have low energy costs, try and attract data storage. I think there was a conversation about that maybe happening with Google at one point, or at least it was floated. So continuing to market ourselves as data storage because we have low energy costs, because we can funnel green energy into that. We can funnel wind and solar into that kind of system. That can be really helpful, and that's something that we could definitely tax, because Google, Facebook, Twitter, those kinds of companies aren't going anywhere. But if we can be data storage because we have really good energy systems, that could be a potential revenue source as well. So trying not to put the burden on the lower income, middle class earners, and remembering that people need to pay their fair share. Typically, lower classes already are. And oftentimes, if you have more resources, you're using more resources. You're using up more of what's going around. So if you're a business, if you have a lot of money that that's being protected, that's being that you're using in different places, It's just important that we actually keep it fair.
Are you in favor of raising the minimum wage to $50 an hour?
So I'm in favor of raising the minimum wage. I'm slightly concerned that for Oklahoma, $15 straight up might be a little bit of a shock. I support raising it to about $11 an hour. That's where Arkansas has it right now, and I don't want to be behind Arkansas because that just sucks. So I think we should at least, or at least they're getting it up to $11 an hour maybe next year. I think we should definitely raise it up to $11 an hour. $11 an hour for an individual like living in the Tulsa metro area really still isn't quite a living wage, and certainly not when you factor in healthcare. However, it's closer, and I think that recognizing that we need to maybe have a little bit of a compromise is important, just because it hasn't been raised in so long. So I think starting at $11 an hour and then trying to put a mechanism in that updates it, if not yearly, then that ties it to inflation in some way, is important. Because the whole idea of a minimum wage is that it takes care of your minimum needs. And if employers can require that you have a personal vehicle, they need to make sure they're compensating you enough to pay for that personal vehicle. If they require that you have a place to live, they need to make sure that they're actually paying you enough for a place to live. I was basically subsidizing my employer's growth by the fact that he was not paying me a fair wage at my last job. And I still have a beef about that because I was doing the work of professional and I was putting in a lot of hours, a lot of dedication, a lot of creativity, and he was definitely exploiting my labor. And that's not okay. $15 an hour. I would like to see that happen. But I think that we need to at least have the conversation first of $11 or $12 an hour. Along with that, I know that there's different arguments about different municipalities or communities raising their minimum wage individually. Back in 2014, I believe, under Mary Fallin, the Oklahoma legislature took that power because Oklahoma City was talking about raising their minimum wage. I understand the argument that says it might not be okay to create neighboring competition, might not make a great vibe for the state. It might not be a very good environment for the state to be in, but it doesn't cost the same to live in Tulsa and Oklahoma City as it might to live in Yukon or Atoka or Ada or Miami or Collinsville. Collinsville, for instance, has a lot of wealth disparity and not very much affordable housing. So you actually would have to live maybe in Owasso or Tulsa if you are going to be in the Collinsville area. But other places, so basically by decentralizing the minimum wage and allowing it to go back to communities, I think being able to tie that to community structures makes more sense as long as we have, as long as we have that state minimum still in place. Because even if you're in Ada or Yukon, you're still going to need about $11 an hour at the very least.
All right. And where are you at on legalizing marijuana?
I know that's a fun, complicated question. I honestly don't know a ton about it. I think that the way we've got it structured now with the medical cards, honestly, I think giving it a little bit more time here might be good. With the way that people are voting, the way that people even talk about people who have cards or people who use their medical cards, it might be good to give Oklahoma a little bit more time to get used to it, especially since we just shocked everybody's systems by allowing alcohol in regular stores. And now we're talking about, Sunday liquor sales. And I think giving everybody a little bit more time to get used to the concept will actually make it work better in the end. But coupled with that, it is critical to decriminalize it. You can't have one. I don't believe you should have one without the other. So I feel like we have one part of that conversation a lot, but we don't have the decriminalization part. And that goes back to, the first, I can't remember the name of the piece of legislation back in 1914. It's basically started the drug war, or the war on drugs. And so that was back in 1914. And it's just been ingrained in our system for over 100 years. And so working on the social construct of drugs, working on our social reality, is an important part of making sure that that's an effective, long-term, non-reactionary change that people are okay with. So in that sense, I would call myself relatively progressive, but also incremental. Along with that, though, I've heard from constituents even who have had a lot of success treating themselves and their kids to get off of heavy pharmaceuticals. And so I think continuing to recognize the medical properties that are there, the necessity of keeping that in place for people, and the help that it does bring them is another really important part of the conversation surrounding marijuana, and continuing to allow that freedom as well as to talk about it again, destigmatizing the concept, I think would be critical. So maybe in 10 or 15 years, 5, 10, 15 years, I like 5 increments of 5. Maybe that would be something to look at and to kind of figure out where the Oklahoma is as a whole.
All right. The last question I have here is, who are your favorite music artists?
I was worried about this question. Probably talking to the most boring person alive when it comes to that. So, as a rule, I don't like to listen to music with words very much. It's just personal preference. I pretty much exclusively listen to film music soundtracks. So, like when they did the Spotify 10-year whatever wrap up, consistently hitting was John Williams. So John Williams, so Star Wars. Jaws is a little bit too intense, but Star Wars, I'm blanking, Indiana Jones, The Book Thief, Schindler's List, War Horse. He really changed, I think, after Schindler's List. He really starts to shift a little bit with age, with tone. It's just, I love John Williams. John Barry, who did Dances with Wolves and a lot of the Bond films, the original Bond films. Love his music. James Horner, so Braveheart, Glory, lots of bells, big soundtracks. And then there's the whole, there's the film composers from the 40s, 50s, and 60s, like Bernard Herrmann, who's a favorite with Alfred Hitchcock and a bunch of those other ones that are just, I don't know, they're fun. Recently, I've been listening a little bit more to Ludwig Göransson, I think is his name. He did The Mandalorian. And The Mandalorian is probably one of the best soundtracks I've heard recently because it doesn't sound like a temp track. It actually sounds like he made it. He also did the music for Black Panther. So I was listening to that again today, and trying to figure out what his tone is, because each of them has a tone, and I haven't isolated his yet. So, and the Wonder Woman theme from the 2017 film is the No Man's Land. That theme is just literally the best thing in the world.
Okay. Were you in band in high school?
Nope. I played mandolin for 2 years, never practiced. I can sing, but music is not my thing. So I like to listen to music that makes me feel alive and ready and brave.
All right. Well, thank you for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Where can we find you on social media, and where's your campaign website?
Yeah, so my campaign website is emilieforoklahoma.com, and I have one of those fun names that's spelled differently than it sounds. So it's Emilie is Emily. So emilieforoklahoma.com. I just redid the website, so we have a map up. We have a contact us page now. I'm really excited about how it looks. We are also on Facebook. That's Emilie for Oklahoma. It might also be under Emilie Tindle for Oklahoma House District 11. There's a little bit of both going on the Facebook. Instagram is Emilie for Oklahoma, and Twitter is Emilie for OK. And I'm pretty active on all 3 of those. Try to share stories when I can about different things that we're doing, and then do about 1 or 2 posts a day. Keep everybody updated with where we're at and what we're up to.
All right. Well, I wish you luck on the campaign trail. And yeah, nice talking to you.
You too. Have a great night, Gregory.
You too.